everybody, and welcome to ABL Down on the Farm, episode 47, where we talk all things fantasy baseball prospecting, but especially prospecting in the ABL, a 30-team Dynasty league with 20 minor league slots per team for a glorious 600 prospects. And today we have a jam-packed show. I'm joined by Dylan again. I'm on the show as a frequent guest and was on just very recently to talk about the first-year player draft as we were doing it live. And today we're going to be talking, among other things, about Connor Griffin and how good he may be and how young he is being promoted to the Pittsburgh Pirates lineup. He's on the ABL Giants in our league. So without further ado, I will bring in Dylan. And Dylan, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
All right, cool. I like, you're still wearing your Red Sox paraphernalia. This is good, even though you're on the AB Athletics. So we'll have to get you some A's paraphernalia at some point if you can bring yourself to wear it.
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually talking to a buddy of mine that runs a men's league around here that I'm playing in this spring. It's a 30 and over league, and there's 6 teams, and they're doing a draft next weekend. And one of the teams is the A's, and the typical process of everyone going and grabbing a New Era hat once they get drafted is sort of the approach. And so it's like, well, maybe I'll kill 2 birds with one stone here if I get drafted to the Athletics. So.
Well, good for you being able to play in a 30 and over league at all. So
I don't know how this is going to go. Truthfully, I think the average age of the league is maybe 47, with some true outliers there across the board. So excited to see how it goes. But yeah, glad to join you here.
Yeah, we'll have to revisit this topic later on in the season and see how you're doing. I don't want any ACL injuries, so make sure to stretch.
Take it a little easy on the base paths. Yeah,
make sure to stretch beforehand. So a lot to cover today. And I think the big elephant in the room is that Connor Griffin has come up to the major leagues, which is pretty remarkable. We're going to talk about Connor. Did you get a chance to watch him play yesterday?
Yeah, I seen the first at bat there, and he really smoked that hit there, and it was cool to see his dad giving an interview about how he's been doing the hit tracks on Pittsburgh's home park there, and how they were calling that, I think it was Connor's Corner or something like that, right where he hit that ball, and it's easy to see, even with his level of power, which I'm sure we'll get into. He's not someone that necessarily needs to put the ball over the fence to make a huge impact on this team, right? He's just has so much speed and hits the ball so hard. And as we've seen with a lot of these guys, like, this is an insane comparison, but someone like Yandy Diaz, who doesn't elevate the ball all that much, can still have an extremely long career because of how hard he does hit the ball regardless of his launch angle, right? So I think the future is just super bright for this kid, and I think the hype machine is off the rails at this rate, and for all the right reasons. Yeah,
I was interested to see the energy level that he brought to PNC Park. It was really palpable, and I know that Duke was actually at the game, so I'm interested to hear from him at some point what that experience was like. But my sense of it is he really energized that team and the fan base. They were even excited when he got a call overturned with ABS. I mean, they were like freaking out about that. Of course, he struck out on the next pitch, but he's an electric base runner. We'll talk about his skills, and we might as well get into that now. I put together some notes on this. So, Connor, when I released the handbook this year, he was the first player to get a perfect 10.0 rating. And I talked in the handbook about how that came into being. One of the things I think is interesting is that his Baseball America grades and his Baseball HQ grades really improved over 2024. He went from a 60 grade player in Baseball America, for example, to a 75 grade player overall, which is a huge leap. Right. And I have here is weighted on base average last season, 2025, which was ridiculous. 19 years old. He had reached AA already. Obviously, he's in the majors now. Right. 6'4", 225, great frame. But it's really this combination of just elite skills, both power and speed. You can see his power and speed grades down there, 70 and 80. Mm-hmm. And you saw some of that speed yesterday on the base path. Mm-hmm. And really young for his level, all the way through. And we'll talk about his ascent through the majors. But before I do that, I was also thinking that I previewed him in last year's draft preview. He was my third overall ranked prospect. And so I went back and I looked at my show that I did for that episode. And I did this little clip of what I said about Connor Griffin. I thought we'd just play it and check. Connor Griffin is a guy that I've really moved up the board. I had him much further down. But as I was looking at this board and thinking about the ABL format, this is a guy who has the potential to be the number one player in this class. He has an enormous upside and also enormous risk because he's so young. And as I'll get into in a moment, his hit tools in question. But a very interesting prospect at the third pick overall. And you'll see from the players that follow, I think this might be worth the risk taking. If I had my pick, I'd still trade down from here and try to get him a little bit later in the first round, because I think he'll fall in favor of some of the safer picks that you'll see coming up. But let's talk about Connor a little bit, who I really like, and I like his upside. 60 overall grade. He's got that 60-70 power speed mix that you like to see. He's a strong fielder. And I put that on here because there's a better chance that he'll reach the majors as a result, and that he'll get a really good run at trying to, earn the starting job when the player can field. He'll also have the ability potentially to move to another position because he's a great athlete. So if he doesn't work out at shortstop, you could see him at second base. You could see him in the outfield in the same way that Jazz Chisholm has moved around the diamond and been valuable in that way from a fantasy perspective. I don't know. I can live with that.
Yeah. It's a decent flag count, yeah.
Yeah. So, and he ended up getting drafted kind of in the middle of the first round, as I recall in ABL. When I say middle, I mean middle of the top 10. Mm-hmm. And I was able to actually execute that strategy of trading down to get Griffin in another league where I had the first overall pick, and I traded it, and I traded back to 8, and I got Connor at 8. So somebody picked Pizzana first. So it's just interesting to see where the hype machine was then. Mm-hmm. People were excited about him, but they were like safer players in a lot of college bats last year. Mm-hmm. And now he's just leapfrogged all those guys. So if we go back to the slide deck I put together on Connor, mm-hmm. I did this little comparison of players who were 19 years old when they debuted relative to Connor. And you can see from this list, he stacks up pretty well. He's one of the fastest 19-year-olds to ever get to the major leagues. Mm-hmm. On this particular list, only Juan Soto was faster. Mm-hmm. But if you go to the next slide, which I put together, and I also put their performance in the first year in there together, and it is notable like how much Mike Trout struggled in his first year. And I'm interested in your perspective in this, what do you think is a reasonable expectation if you're a Pirates fan of what Connor Griffin should be able to do this year? What would make you happy and what would alarm you?
Yeah. So even looking at this list here, you have a pretty decent split of guys that do bring some speed to the table versus some that weren't necessarily burners. And I think even if we see Connor struggle, maybe with like the glorified stat of home runs, right? Like maybe he's not crushing balls over the fence right away. I think that level of speed that he has elevates what he can still do, even if he struggles from the fantasy lens. But I think the other thing he has to double down on too is he's a great fielder, right? At a premium position. I think barring any episodes of the yips, it's easy to see like a pretty simple floor for him, right? Of, even if he's not hitting for a ton of power, even miss hits to the infield, he reasonably could beat out to first base, right? So, and having that speed on the base paths once you're on first, I think pays a lot of dividends. So, I mean, you could even see when he scored after that hit, I mean, the speed at which he went from second to home was just like mind boggling. Like he just kind of floats around the bases, right? So I think the floor is pretty high with this kid, and I think we'll see that pretty quickly here.
Yep. No, I agree with you that the floor is a very solid one with him, particularly given the athletic attributes that you flagged, his fielding and his speed, which were something I mentioned in the clip as well. We have a question from the audience here. Like, will Connor Griffin's career be wasted with the Pirates? Would it be in his interest to force a trade to the great team like the Diamondbacks? It's clearly written by a Diamondback fan.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. Like the Pirates, you know, while they get crapped on quite a bit, and they've been down in recent years, I mean, it's easy to forget that they have had great runs of success, and they actually have had the ability to develop star players and make them the foundation, the core of their team. And you know, I've lived through 3 of those generational, moments. The first one was the Dave Parker team and the Willie Stargell team in the 70s, which is actually like the Roberto Clemente team before he passed. I didn't see Clemente play. I was too young. But I do remember, Stargell and Parker, and what they brought to the table. And there are other good players on those teams as well. But then, we had the Bonds-Bonilla team, in the early 90s. And they were really good for a long time. And then, we had the Andrew McCutchen, Starling Marte team, right? And that team was really good for a long time, and very competitive.
Right, guys that are still floating around now at a late age in their career, right? Like it just goes to show how consistent they've been, and they were really performing when they were on those teams.
Yeah, and I agree, and they were a really good team, really competitive. I mean, they dug Draybeck on that team, and that's going back to the Bonds team. But the Pirates can't put it together, and if you look at their team right now, they have a lot of really interesting young players on that team and players coming up, and not all of them have worked out the way they planned. I mean, you look at Nick Gonzalez, he's struggled. Henry Davis has really struggled. Connor is kind of in a different class from those guys. And they have some pitching that is really scary if you're an opponent of the Pirates. Bubba Chandler has been struggling with his command, but when you look at his stuff, it's elite. Obviously, Skeens is in the rotation. Mitch Keller has turned into a very serviceable veteran pitcher. And they've got guys coming up. They just drafted Seth Hernandez. They've got other guys in the minors coming up in the rotation.
Yeah, it seems like their next guy up is always somewhat from a pitching perspective has always been someone that is like half decent, right? Like whether it's like there's guys that Antoine Kelly, for instance, that have like really performed in the minors that like don't even come to mind when you think of Pirates pitchers, right? Or another one, Hunter Barco, that broke camp with the team. And from an ABL perspective, I was really hoping he made the rotation. But at this point, he's just kind of working in middle relief. But if someone goes down and he has to step up, I think he went from having something like 3 to 6 pitches just from the end of last season to spring training this year. So we know the Pirates pitching machine has been at work here, right?
Yeah.
Up and down the organization.
Absolutely. And even some, their cast-off pitchers have gone on to be successful as well.
Garrett Cole, right?
Yeah, Garrett Cole, like, Quinn Priester's maybe turning into a serviceable guy. The list goes on. I mean, so, I know the comment, the question was kind of tongue in cheek, but I will tell you truthfully, I like the Pirates the next 5 to 10 years more than I like the Diamondbacks. I'll take the team in Pittsburgh, whether they have the money to keep the team together. Those questions, I don't know. And, as good as the Pirates have been over the years in those generational, rosters that I was talking about, I mean, only like one of them won the World Series, the Stargell and Parker team. So being good is not necessarily enough, but they have been entertaining and competitive. And I think you're, seeing another period approaching where they can be that again. And Griffin's going to be like the linchpin of that. So I just wanted to round out this discussion about early promotions. These are two guys who are younger. One going way back to the original New York Mets, Ed Kranepool, who was 17 years old when he came to the major leagues, which is shocking.
Crazy.
But of course, Alex Rodriguez was very, very young when he came up and only had 82 games of minor league experience when he was promoted. So, at least we forget about A-Rod. Although you can see he really struggled with a 33.9% strikeout rate that first, year. Not a lot of plate appearances, 59 plate appearances for A-Rod when he first came up. But that's kind of like the list in the modern era, if we want to include poor Ed Kranepool in the modern era. But, there are times in the past where players like in the 50s and 60s or the late 40s and 50s, because of the roster rules, if you signed somebody to a big bonus, you actually had to have them on your roster for 2 years. So Sandy Koufax, for example, went directly to the major leagues. And, it's
Seems
interesting.
to have worked out pretty well for him.
It did. Although, it's interesting. Koufax was known to have struggled with his command at the beginning of his career. And people thought he might be a bust. And he finally came into his own and figured out the command issue. In more modern times, he would have done that work in the minor leagues. Right. But he learned on the job at the major league level. So just, a different era. So these are modern era comparisons. I did not go all the way back to antiquity to figure this out.
Different era, unless you're the Angels, because that appears to be how they're treating their top prospects. At least we'll put you in the majors, learn here, we'll figure it out. Well, the Angels are the paradigm for success, right?
So what are maybe the benchmarks for Connor, right? And so I put these two recent analogous players on the screen, both of whom are like extraordinary players. Griffey's in the Hall of Fame, and Soto is going to be in the Hall of Fame, barring some catastrophe. Very similar game totals. The context is a little bit different. Soto was, actually in the system for a few years. He had some injuries, so it slowed his ascent. Slow, but by 122 games. But he might have actually been there earlier, right? And if you go back and look at the slide deck about his stats, he was phenomenal in his debut year. And of course, Griffey is, a well-known example of a kid who was just, he came into the major leagues and just started hitting. Also stole 45 bases his first year. An extraordinary player, obviously. But this is kind of the pool of players that you're talking about with Connor Griffin, right? I mean, somebody asked me recently, like, who would you compare this kid to, like, in terms of his potential, right? And, he was asking me, like, about players that are playing today. Like, he said, is he A-Rod? Is he this? Is that? I said, Willie Mays. Like, you don't get to see this kind of power and speed blend very often, coupled with extreme athleticism and defensive ability. A true 5-tool player. He's very exciting. Doesn't mean he's going to have that career, right? But in terms of the sky's the limit, like, I don't know. It's high. It's very high.
When you look at these two other players as well, and you consider the years that we're talking about, right, with Griffey being drafted in 87, Soto, I mean, prior to 2018, I don't know the specific year there, but when we consider how far analytics and strength training and knowledge around these items have come to this point, it's hard to see Griffin not stacking up to the list, right? Because he has more tools. Not literally. I mean, we know he is a tool shed, but like he has more tools to be able to build around his skills.
Yes.
And where he also may struggle, right? The teams provide them with so much more now, and as well as them investing in themselves. I mean, you heard, like you said, his dad, they clearly have some hit tracks machines set up at their home for him to work on, right? So like Griffey had nothing like that in 87, right? So being able to select the park that you're hitting in, like that is so foreign to what Griffey had to deal with, right? So it's easy to see here to stacking up to this group, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. If you go back even further, a guy like Willie Mays, he had stickball. It's just like, they didn't have all this stuff, right? But yeah, it's a new era. There's a lot of new technology available for these guys. And, as you said, they can train in the off season in ways that, just were not available to players in the past, which, should reduce the margin for error. It's still baseball. It's still a hard game, and the corollary, I suppose, to the point we just made is that pitchers are also being able to adjust much better than they used to be able to, to adjust to. So it goes both ways. The competition generally is stiffer.
Right.
And one of the reasons it's stiffer is because of these enhanced technologies and strength training and, all those things that you mentioned. So, I want to get to this. So that's the Connor Griffin portion of the show. Very excited to see him play as we go forward. We can revisit this later in the year, but super excited for the Pirates fans. I was really happy to see it for their fan base yesterday, and we'll see how it plays out.
Do you mind if I share one thing quick?
Yeah, please,
Steve. I wanted to show the app there that I had sent you.
Yeah, please go for it.
Screenshot from. Yeah. Let me pull this up here. So what I did was able to pull in the relevant StatCast information we have on Griffin. You can see on the right here we have.
Oh, you got to share it. Let me put it on the screen. There you go.
Yeah, we have 2025's low A metrics for Griffin on the right, and then we have actually his most recent 2026 AAA information on the left here. And we can actually see, obviously, this is a significantly smaller sample size than what we're looking at on the right, but even that considered, 151 batted balls, this isn't a huge sample size either. So it is interesting to see like the stark differences between the two as well in some cases, right? Like he's really elevated his hard hit launch angle and his average launch angle this year, even with obviously only 12 batted balls here, but we can see across 151 at low A last year, his launch angles being significantly beneath that. But what are the two things that look eerily similar? If we look at slugging on contact, right, that tells me even regardless of these launch angles, he's still producing based on, I mean, these EVs really, which are upper echelon when you consider his age. These metrics are all comparing against the average MLBer as well, right? So he's 5.3 miles per hour ahead of the average MLBer at his age, which is just astronomical. Once again, still we have to consider the fact that these are still pretty small samples, but you'll actually see I have the WRC plus noted for each here. And it's just, these are with park factors included. And I'm really looking forward to sharing this app with ABLers and just to be able to compare players once we have some more StatCast information on people. It should be a fun use.
Yeah, this is phenomenal stuff, Dylan. So, for the audience, where can they get this app? And, tell us a little bit about the process that you've gone through, because I know it's been a journey to put this together.
Yeah. So my goal here was just to provide like kind of a one-stop shop to be able to compare multiple players with information that isn't simple to find on the internet. I know there are a lot of prospectors on Twitter and Blue Sky that provide information like this, but not necessarily a spot where you can compare potentially multiple players or look at how these stats are stacked up against the average player, right? Like, so my goal with this is to hopefully provide fantasy players just with an ability to see into more StatCast information, because it's really not simple to track down minor league StatCast information on the internet. And all of this is pulled in live. So even as players are beginning to produce, we should see live updates here, especially against the averages will change and WRC pluses will change. And I thought the really cool part of this app so far for me has been able to include Baseball America's park factors from last year into these stats, where even something as high quality as Fangraphs doesn't account for any park factors. So I think even his WRC plus, I think if you look through Fangraphs, maybe 210. So clearly, even with the park factors here for Griffin, it's really elevated what he's done over these 12 batted balls. So like I said, it's exciting. I'm sure once this app is ready to be public facing, I'll maybe have to catch up with you here, and we'll be able to release a link to everyone for their use.
I think that's great. I mean, this is phenomenal stuff. And you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to get reliable information off the internet, particularly for, anything below AAA. So this is like really interesting and fascinating. And so we should talk also about integrating some of this stuff into the handbook, because I started integrating stats, and I'm very interested in getting exit velocity, integrated. If we can get reliable exit velocity for lower minors, then we may be coming to a day where that's doable. And the park factor element of it is very interesting too, because I think it's hard to compare prospects across different levels and across different leagues, right? Because some of the environments are really extreme. And so when you're looking at, the stats for a Seattle Mariners prospect in AA, it's a field they play in that really suppresses offensive performance. So if you're a casual or fan, you look at the stats, you can say, oh well, Michael Arroyo is not like that impressive. But if you look at it with an eye towards the fact that he's playing in a suppressing environment, you're like, oh, that's kind of more interesting,
right?
And Montez is another one. A Mariner prospect is similar to that. They're at the same level.
And even looking at this, right, like we're missing a giant chunk of Connor's production from 2025, right? Because, and the reason being, his high A and double A appearances don't have any StatCast data. Right. So like we're missing, I think, well over half of the pie here in looking at this. So you have to kind of take it with that sort of breath, but at the same time, this can be super useful if you're looking at potentially 2026 low A guys and trying to find pop-up guys ahead of your league mates. Yep.
And you're starting to see it, this data being harnessed by Baseball America, for example, where they have this hot sheet that they produce, and they're now producing StatCast rankings of players. So they're obviously getting access to some data that us plebes don't get on the regular basis, but it's going to be interesting, I think, over the next five years or so, how much StatCast data starts becoming available at the lower levels in the minors, because it's clearly stuff that major league teams have access to. So the question is, when are we going to get access to it?
Right.
So I wanted to switch gears just briefly to talk about J15s a little bit and myths versus reality. When I released the handbook this year, there was a lot of discussion in Discord about the J15s that I had ranked in the top 100, or how, ranking them high, and whether it was deserved, and whether or not J15s have a lower hit rate than other players, in terms of hit rate being defined as being major league players. And so I just did a study, went down a Gemini hole and I did a study of players for the years 2011 through 2021. And I asked, for results for the top 5 J15 players, defined as the top 5 signing bonuses, which is not necessarily the 5 best J15 players. It's just, I just ranked them in that way because it was simple to rank them that way. And then I asked for the top 10, which diluted the numbers a little bit because you have the 6 through 10 in that list, and compared them to first year player draft, first round players for college and high school. And so these are the results based on a couple of metrics that I was measuring. One, how many of these players reached all-star games? What percentage became all-stars? And 2, how many became multi-season starters, defined by like 130 games or more, which gives some buffer for injury and the like, or partial becoming a starter during the year as opposed to the full season. And these are the percentages which you can take for whatever you think they're worth. I'm interested in your reactions to them, but just to highlight a couple things, college hitters, and I was only studying hitters. Okay, so college hitters had a 26% success rate in becoming multi-season starters. And J15s, the top 5 J15s, 21%. And they perform better than high schoolers at the hitting level. And if you dilute the J15 pool by injecting 6 through 10, it really drops. So you can see how powerful the top 5 J15 players are in this study. But what was really interesting to me, at least, was the all-star percentages. And the hit rate was the highest for the J15s. College next, prep hitters last, right? But what are your kind of reactions to some of this stuff?
Yeah. So, and I do recall the conversation you were having in the server where there was some pushback on the quality of J15s and whether it does pan out. And I think the hardest thing for people to rationalize when they are looking at these players is the sheer amount of time that they spend in the minor league organization before they are elevated. Like the Juan Sotos are that's such an outlier compared to what most J15s go through, right?
Yep.
And, people in ABL may tend to play in. It's not easy to track someone's performance and name recognition across all these years, right? So it's easy for the anecdotal evidence to be, well, these guys don't really make it all that often. But yeah, when it takes potentially 5 years for a guy to make it, I mean, yeah, it's easy for that guy to be cast in the wayside of your brain, because when you have college hitters that can be up within a couple months in some organizations, it's much easier to cling to that, right? And I think we just get exhausted by prospects that aren't elevated by their teams very often, right? Like Cade Cavalli has been in the Nationals or in the minors just forever, it feels like, right? He was drafted in, I think, 2020, and he's producing at a decent clip. And I feel like not a lot of people are talking about it, even though he was a first round pick and has the pedigree and has the velo. But I think he's been around so long that it's like
prospect fatigue.
He's just like, the fatigue is just out there, right? And I think that can tend to happen with J15s. And then when you look at some of the high profile guys that got cast by the wayside, Marco Luciano, Luis Matos, right? It's easy to get distracted by the ones that don't work out.
Yep. Right. I think there's definitely anecdotal bias and fatigue that goes into this kind of like blind spot to the J15s and how successful they are. But let's dig a little bit deeper. I wanted to talk a little bit about the handbook's top 100. Which really is not the point about the handbook. The handbook's about grading prospects, and having a granular grading system so you can see relative, value across, the entire pool of players in the ABL. But it does generate the top 100, so I publish it. So this is the makeup of the top 100, my top 100. And you can see the J15s are 31%. High school draft picks are actually 44%. There's a lot of pitchers in there. This is not limited to hitters, right? And college is 25%. Okay. And the handbook is trying to measure upside. right? And it really values the ceilings of these players. It does account for risk, as I've talked about on other shows, but I'm always not surprised when the J15s and the high schoolers are elevated higher than the college hitters or college players, generally speaking. This is a broad brush I'm painting with, because their upsides tend to be higher. And I note down in the bottom box, like the number of players in this top 5, the next 10, and then outside the top 10 of J15s, again, defined by signing bonus, which is not like a great metric to define them by. But I just use that to sort them. And you can see it's like pretty evenly split, top 10 versus outside the top 10, right? But then I thought it'd be interesting to compare this to another regularly published, publicly available top 100 list. So this is MLB Pipeline, and this is their breakdown. So, they shift some of the percentages to high school and college, but high school is still the predominant top 100 list, which again talks about, upside. It speaks to upside. And then, the J15s are still 26%, roughly equivalent to college players, right? Notably, they have they have more players outside the top 10 J15s than I have on my list. But there's still quite a few J15s in their top 100, right? So, then I have a side-by-side comparison for ease of viewing, of the percentages. And so I'm curious what your reactions are to that. I have some observations too, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, at first glance here, it is funny to see that Pipeline's percentage is so low when you consider the scale at which they grade players, right? Like if you were to just look at some of the grades they've placed on their international signees, I feel like you would think there would be more of them in their top 100, because I think they do their rankings are a bit risky, I guess, or more, maybe they're more ceiling based than I think others can be, like Baseball America, right? So it was surprising to see that low of a percentage, I suppose. Because
I'll tell you a little secret about their rankings. That when they get around to ranking the top 30s and the top 100, they lower the grades.
Interesting.
Right. So when you read their international, if you compare their international signing board, right, their top international signing board versus their top 100, their team top 30s, which come out a little bit later in the off season, you'll see a drop in the prospect grades for the J15s.
Yeah, like if you went into a first year player draft just looking at their top international signees, that would be every one of your picks if you were just banking all your knowledge on that. Like the way that they rank players, you would see so much upside if you were just blinded by that, right? And I do appreciate that. You want to take in as much information about these players as possible. So it is interesting to see that as a data point, but you do have to temper the expectations a bit.
Yeah, no, I agree. I talked about this on the show with Jeff last time around about, how the handbook evaluates these players. And I put more emphasis on Baseball America's grading of these players, which tends to be a little bit more conservative. And the other elements that I put in, risk, ceiling risk, frame, they have an impact on where players are ranked pretty dramatically in some cases. It's still driven by the scouting grades, but it's not skewed by the pipeline grades that these players get. It ends up kind of flattening the pool a little bit. So I end up with more, I think, J15s in my list because of the other elements that I use to evaluate players, which is ceiling risk, age to level, and their frame. Those are, the main drivers. So, just kind of an interesting comparison for what it's worth. Still a lot of J15s in either list. But this next slide about the J15s, I found really interesting. So if you take a look at major league rosters today, okay, 38% of opening day lineups were J15 players. Right? 1 in 5 players, hitters on major league rosters are J15 players. So that includes bench players. But 38% of the starting lineups on opening day were J15 players. Okay. In terms of the hitters. Now, most of the J15 pitchers end up being closers.
Interesting.
Right? 30% of closers today came up through the J15 process. Now there are obviously outliers. You got Yuri Perez was a J15. There are other guys who are in the starting rotation. Esteban Mejia in the Orioles organization is a guy who's like really got an up arrow for a prospect. But the other thing I thought was interesting to look at was, well, how many people were on the All-Star team last year that were J15s? And it's 26% of the roster, right? And that includes like players who this percentage is based on the 81 players who got all-star selections based on injuries and being not able to play. So there were replacements. So this is just like the overall out of that 81 player pool, they were 26% of the all-stars. And if you remember, like on the slide I showed earlier, there was that 22% all-star hit rate for J15s. So I don't know if you have any reactions to that. Did any of these numbers surprise you? Or
no, if you were to ask me to guess, I don't think my estimate would be that high. I think it would be in the teens, which I think it kind of confirms sort of what this like anecdotal evidence we're speaking about is that there may be some level of fatigue surrounded around these prospects. And it's just easy to get distracted and not realize how many of these guys bounce around in systems, having taken a bonus less than $50,000 and been in the minors for 6 years, and then pop, they found a little command, and here we are. Here's Framber Valdez, right? So yeah, it's 26, nearly 26% is definitely surprising of that all-star list.
Yeah, I mean, and the one that really stood out to me was the 38% of lineups on opening day. Wow. Right. And if you think about that, like if I told you there was a pool of prospects that could result in a 38% of starting lineups on opening day, would you like look at that prospect pool seriously and when you're drafting?
Right. Yeah,
you would.
And Steve, I think what we need to do too is record all this information and rerun this next spring. And I'd be really hard pressed to think this number isn't going to go up. Considering some of the academies that the MLB has set up in the West Indies, and it's just like it's hard to see this number not going up at this point, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, Dylan. And I think there's another factor. I mean, you put your finger on something that's important, which is the quality of the infrastructure that major league teams have surrounded this process with, which has improved dramatically, even in that time period that I was looking at 2011, to 2021. The first part of that period is very different than the second part of that period. Right. Like we have seen vast improvements in the infrastructure. We have also seen a lot better tournament play, competition level amongst the J15s. But another factor that was interesting to me, in 2016, Major League Baseball imposed caps on how much teams could spend on the J15 process. And that imposed, among other things, a level of discipline in how teams are going to spend their money. My theory on that is that the Major League Baseball teams became a lot more careful and spent a lot more time evaluating these J15 prospects before investing in them with a paycheck, right? And so conceptually what that should do is elevate the quality of the top signed prospects. Right. So, if you see Luis Hernandez get like a $5 million signing bonus, right? That should tell you something. It means more now than it did in 2005. Right. Because, the Giants, who are not like a wealthy team relative to the other ones, really invested in this kid. Right. They can still be busts, of course. They're like teenagers. They have a long track record to the major leagues. But I think that's something that folks need to consider as well is just kind of how much improved the infrastructure is, as you pointed out, but also like I think teams are being much more disciplined about throwing the money around.
Yeah. And like you said, with the infrastructure, I think one thing that caught my eye previously, and if I'm speaking about the wrong player, you'll have to let me know. I think it might have been Henry Lalane that was actually born in New York, but moved to the Dominican Republic to play. Like when I heard that, yeah, like I feel like I would have thought the process maybe in like the late 20th century, early 21st century, like it would have been the opposite, right? Like I would assume coming to America would be a big ordeal to be able to play here in the US, but learning of players being born here and going there to play speaks to that infrastructure growth from teams, right? In that the opportunities there are nearly as good as the ones here, right? So
in many cases, that's true. Right. I think that the question is whether all the players in the DSL, for example, or the J15 circuit are getting the same access to the technology that we talked about before, and whether their families have the means to buy hit tracks for them. Like, we were talking about Connor Griffin and like the access to, data and the access to technology that he has. I don't think it's the same universally. That's a broad brush, but if we just take a very high level view that there's more money in the United States and families tend to have more income per family. There are of course rich people in the Dominican Republic and Venezuela. I'm not saying there aren't, but these not all these players come from wealthy families. So there is some disparity, but I think the top prospects who the teams are really investing in, like they have access.
Right. And that's right. It does seem like the teams are trying to raise the floor for those players that wouldn't necessarily have that access. And I do think that is a very new thing, right? Like this is like we're talking about 2025 to now that these academies have been severely or much more built out than how they probably were in the 2010s, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So let's shift your gears again. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about prospecting in early April, because we've just started the minor league seasons. AAA started the same day as opening day, but Double A and Single A are just kicking off. We're starting to see some exciting clips about some of the top draft picks and how they did in the first two starts, or sometimes first start, or how hitters are doing right away. The complex leagues, they're going to start in May, and then we'll have the DSL, in June, early June starts. And I'm interested, Dylan, in your kind of approach to prospecting during this time of year. Do you have any golden rules, or do you have any things that you look to, to start evaluating these prospects when we don't have a lot of data?
Yeah. So from a fantasy lens, I'll say that I tend to look at the historical transactions that of each waiver run more often than seeking out like the early small sample performances of prospects, because I feel like oftentimes I'm not one that wants to react to those small samples, but if someone is going to, I'm curious who they're dropping, because oftentimes I may be more interested in that player that someone may be throwing in the towel on, where maybe they're slightly underperforming this year, but the pedigree may be there, right? And I was interested to see, I think in a lot of leagues already, I saw Luis Lara bouncing around a lot, and I think he might have popped a home run already, right? And it was interesting to see because he had a lot of helium. Maybe it was like 18 months ago or so, and then fell off a lot of radars. Now he's back, and it does kind of bring up that point of like, well, is that overreacting to a small sample, or did the public overreact to his 2025, right? Like, so there are some small samples where it may be worth jumping on because this guy may have had some helium in the past and performed previously. And as we've seen with, this is a poor example I'm not comparing Luis Lara to Alex Rodriguez, but we saw A-Rod's pedigree and then him come and really level off in the MLB and his first taste of the bigs, and then him figuring it out, right? So we know performance isn't linear. So keeping that in mind with someone like Luis Lara is important to jump on a guy like that you may see performing. But yeah, like I said, I tend to look at I try to look at the guys that have been dropped to see like where can I find the guys that people are low on currently that I think still have some potential.
Yep. No, I think that's a good point. I have a similar point that I'll make, which is I'm not necessarily looking. I mean, if guys are dropped, sure, I'm going to look at those. But I'm also looking for guys on people's rosters who I like, and I like based on my scouting grades, the factors that I have in the handbook that I evaluate prospects on, who maybe the owner is getting a little fatigue about, right? Particularly if that prospect starts slow in the minor leagues, right? Because it's very hard for people not to react to small sample sizes. And then I look for teams that are struggling at the major league level in the first couple weeks, right? And are they desperate to make a move? Are they getting antsy about their roster? And is there an opportunity to poach a prospect that I really like? So that's what I'm looking at, right? I like basically ignore the stats until we get into May. And then even then, I'm only looking at certain things because there's just not reliable sample sizes yet.
Right.
The first stat I become interested in is exit velocity for hitters, which stabilizes pretty quickly. But again, as we pointed out earlier, it's not available in most leagues, some levels, right? So it's like at AAA, sure. So the next thing I look at is like, K percentage and walk percentage for hitters, which stabilizes like, after a certain number of plate appearances. But for pitchers, it's K minus walks that I'm looking at. Right. And that stabilizes pretty quickly, but you're still not really getting there till May or June, maybe even, right? Depending on the level they're at.
And those aren't like the sexy surface stats, right? So sometimes a guy can be putting up decent K minus walk percentage numbers or decent exit velocities, but also not be performing necessarily. So sometimes you can find that potential buy low window, because if, I don't know, some people may be in too many leagues and not able to keep up with anything beyond the stat line, and just going off that, maybe they feel comfortable moving someone that early.
And maybe they have a need at the major league level, right? That they're like, they're desperate to fill. People, when, the first 2 weeks of a fantasy baseball season, which itself is a very small sample size about a team, my experience generally is that owners like really start to panic when things aren't going well early on. And that's a time to take advantage of that situation. So the other thing that I really focus on this time of year is minor league assignments from an age versus level standpoint, because it really shows a vote of confidence by the organization. So I wanted to highlight just a couple players, a few players that caught my eye.
Steve, there was one other thing too that I wanted to add. I guess I did think of one maybe golden rule I stick around, which is I try to find some players that I feel are maybe only missing like one area where they could use some improvement. And if I was to react to a small sample size, that's what I think I'd be looking for. And I have a pretty specific example here of acquiring Merrick Houston, Minnesota's shortstop that they just drafted this past year. I just acquired him from the Rockies in ABL, and he's one that I wanted to get out ahead of in hopes that if he can figure out some level of pop and maybe fix some launch angles, I feel like that's really one area that he's struggling in. If he resolves that, I think the sky is the limit for him. So he's one where in other leagues I am kind of looking at him like, well, if I do see some pop right off the bat, I'm going to send some offers quickly.
Yep, that's interesting. Yeah, no, another factor that strikes me as being relevant to that calculus is what organization they're in.
Right.
And particularly players that, for example, move from one organization to another that are pitchers that have struggled to like pull their command together or like, get their fastball where it needs to be. If they go to the Braves, I'm like, all right, well, now I'm interested. They go to the Mariners. I'm like, okay, like maybe something will change, right?
Right.
And even the Marlins too, who have done a really nice job of developing pitching prospects. So there are opportunities to take advantage of gaps in appreciation about how good a player might be, the ceiling, right? So going back to the minor league assignment point that I was referencing just a moment ago, these are 6 players that just caught my attention. I thought were worth discussing who in their minor league assignments. So I'll just tick through them and, interested in getting your reactions on them as well. So Leo DeVries, who's obviously like a tremendous prospect and everybody knows his name. And I put the, prospect handbook grades in parentheses next to them. AA at age 19. Comes over to the A's, gets this really aggressive assignment. Going to be really fascinated to see how he does right away. But what this assignment tells me is that DeVries may be in the majors this year. And, he's being fast tracked. Now he's got to perform.
The ABLAs are certainly hoping for it.
Yeah, right. I know he's one of your guys, right? Yeah. So, but he could be up. And he could be the next, big thing who comes up after Connor Griffin. Really exciting player, got a lot of tools, huge upside, but again, I would not be shocked if he's in the major leagues this year or early next. So that's what that assignment kind of tells me. Kevin Alvarez is another guy, an Astros prospect. He is skipping the complex league from the DSL and going directly to A-ball. He's 18. He had a tremendous DSL season. Very exciting prospect. Not as highly graded as DeVries in my handbook, but I'll be interested to see how he does at A-ball. It's not unusual to see these guys struggle a little bit when they're that young for the level. But if he performs well, and if I start reading about StatCast metrics that are impressive after we get into July, I'm really excited. Or maybe late June for the StatCast if we hear for A-ball. Any reactions to Kevin Alvarez?
Yeah, I think of this entire list, Steve, that's the most notable one to me. When you consider the lack of prospect quality in the Astros system currently, I think Fangraphs has him maybe at a 45 plus, and I think he's ranked number 1. So that's, I think, very telling of their system there. And what feels like an aging MLB team.
Yep.
Production at A-ball at 18 would tell me a ton about how soon I'm probably going to see him. But even if he struggles, he'd be a pretty quick buy low for me. Just off the strength of, like I said, the lack of quality in the Astros system and what feels like an aging MLB team. And we know the pedigree is there with him, right? So he's definitely a target of mine.
Yeah, no, I like Alvarez as well. For those reasons and just his scouting grades. He's a fun player. Another guy on this list that caught my attention was Eileen Pena of the Mets. He's also skipping complex ball and going to A-ball at 18. And I thought this was a really aggressive assignment by the Mets because Pena did not knock the cover off the ball on the DSL. And you can see his scouting grades in the handbook were pretty average, 5.69. And I'm really interested to see how he does because I could see this kid really struggling at A-ball, and maybe even getting demoted to the complex. Now, if he does well, I'm much more excited about him. But I don't know. Did you have any reactions to that? Or does that surprise you?
Yeah, from a fantasy lens, I do see him kicking around on a lot of not a lot or a few waiver wires in leagues that I'm in. And I was surprised to see that because I do think he carries some level of name notoriety from it was last year's draft, I believe, right? Last year's J15. he's definitely one where if he performs, I think I want to jump on it early, just to take a shot on it, because like we said, with being 18 at A-ball, yeah, I think the only thing really when I look at the difference between Alvarez and Pena there, it just comes down to organization for me. I think the Mets are sitting in a much better spot organizationally with a lot of depth, where the Astros not so much. So
Yeah.
I could see Pena getting stuck in no man's land much more easily than Alvarez.
Yep. No, I think that's an interesting point. Thinking about the pathway to the major leagues in assessing these players' values. Seth Hernandez is another guy. Obviously, he's another very well-known and highly regarded prospect. But he caught my attention because he went directly to A-ball. And with high school pitchers, the traditional thing to do is to start them off in the complex. If nothing else, just to manage their innings.
Right.
But they put Hernandez right in the mix, into it's a shorter season, but it's still like, a much more rigorous testing of him than the complex league would be. He obviously had a really good first start in single A. But I just thought that was noteworthy that the Pirates just advanced him right away. So it'll be very interesting to see how he does, how he holds up over the course of the year. Another guy on this list is Ethan Salas. And so I put him on here for a couple of reasons. One, he missed all of last season basically with injury. Two, there's a ton of prospect fatigue with Ethan Salas. He's been mentioned on the show numerous times. And he just hasn't hit. And it's caused his scouting grades to go down and down and down, right? But I will tell you that Baseball America and a couple other sources are still promoting this guy. Right. And he was just in 2 articles in Baseball America about how he was impressing scouts during the spring. And he had a home run during the breakout game. And people are still talking about him.
Right.
And I think one of the things that is noteworthy about Salas is he's still so young. He's 19 in Double-A ball.
Right.
And it feels like he's been around for 20 years, but he was 17.
Was he working with Salvi over the off season too? Did I see that?
Oh, you might be right about that. That rings a bell. But I would just be really interested to see how he does, because there is a chance that he gets some helium this summer. Right. And I'm fascinated to see what happens with this kid if he can hit. But I just thought it was interesting that he got, he's staying at Double-A. We'll see how he does. And it was really the fact that people are still talking about him on these very well respected websites.
Right.
And the last guy who I mentioned a couple of times, Luis Hernandez, going right to the complex, skipping the DSL at 17. And I think the interesting thing for me there is going to be whether he advances to A-ball at some point this summer. And how he does there immediately at 17 years old.
I was hoping Evan was gonna accept my trade that I sent him this morning for that involved Hernandez. I won't reveal the full hand there, but he's definitely a guy I'm looking forward to seeing, and it will be fun to have him stateside here. To see what he can do. Fascinating prospect. Really like him. It's always a pain for me to wait for the DSL to start because I had to wait till June to see some of the prospects that I'm really interested in. But and the complex league starts in May, so we don't have that much further to wait. But it's still kind of a tedious process waiting for these leagues to start up, at least from my perspective, because I love prospecting so much. But anyway, thanks so much for coming on the show today. That covers our agenda. Really appreciate you having on. You've done double duty already the last the last 3 weeks or so. So I appreciate that, and looking forward to seeing your app when it gets launched. And we should definitely have you back on to highlight that, showcase it a bit, because I think it's an incredibly useful tool for prospecting. It gives you a lot of data they might not otherwise kind of have at your fingertips. And for everybody else watching live or watching this later, remember to ABP. Always be prospecting. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.